Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to a very special episode of the Koopcast. I'm glad you are all tuned in today, and let's get one thing straight right from the get-go. Today's episode is all about transgender policy in sport, and this is an incredibly complicated and charged topic. And I realize that it's incredibly charged and complicated, and it can go far beyond the hour and a half that Emma and I spent on it. But what I wanted to do with this podcast is just offer an initial taste of what we know about the science of some of this stuff, so that the listeners, the race directors, the runners, and the elite athletes out there can better inform some of their opinions on these particular policies. On the podcast today, I have the incredible Emma Hilton PhD, who is a developmental biologist out of the University of Manchester in the UK. And more importantly to this conversation, she's the lead author on a brand new review article in the journal Sports Medicine, which is titled Transgender Women in the Female Category of Sport, Perspectives on Testosterone Suppression and Performance Advantage. Emma is well known in both social and athletic circles for having very strong opinions on this. And I knew this when I asked Emma onto the podcast. Everybody listening is more than welcome to go and Google any of those viewpoints. They are readily accessible throughout all corners of the internet. And some of you are going to agree and disagree with her various viewpoints. I wanted to bring Emma on the podcast today to talk very specifically about the science. I understand that there's going to be an inevitable Venn diagram overlap between the social constructs of transgender policy and the scientific constructs of transgender policy. I understand that that's inevitable. But my bias as a coach, and especially a coach that works with elite athletes, is to focus on the performance and to focus on the science. Not to discount the rest of it or not to completely ignore the rest of it, but to put more of the focus on that particular aspect. If we want to have a conversation about the social side of it, absolutely, we can have that. But let this podcast be a first little tease into this entire discussion. I hope that everybody listens to this with an open heart and an open and curious mind, and one that is free from any of the biases that you had coming into listening to this podcast. So here we go. I'm going to get right out of the way. Here's my conversation with Emma Hilton, all about transgender policy in sport. It's a weird, quirky sport, as you can imagine. I think the big thing is, we have no singular regulating or governing body. Mm-hmm. And so the rules are essentially race by race. Yes. Some races, and even if you look at things like, do you have to follow the marked course? Some races you can kind of go wherever you want to, and it's a point to point, and first person there wins no matter what route they take.
Like orienteering or something.
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. In other races, you have to follow a very specified route, and then there's hybrids of that and different interpretations of those rules. And so I think that kind of the reason for me sending you over the Western States policy was to kind of orient you not only with their specific policy, but the fact that a lot of different races are trying to navigate this all by themselves, which is, as you can imagine, incredibly difficult to do.
It's difficult at like you say, the kind of overarching, like a federation level, let alone the kind of, the variety that something like ultra running, long distance running provides in terms of course types and, over how many days. And I'm learning about people running, 3,000 kilometers over 40 something days. This is just, this is a sport for the insane.
Well, I have this cheeky little saying that there's always another idiot, right? It doesn't matter how long I've been in the sport, which is about 20 years now.
Okay.
There's always another idiot that's willing to do something more grandiose than the idiots before them. And that's kind of what makes it that's a little bit of what makes it fun. So I'm glad I can expand your horizons a little bit into a new sport. And like I said, I really appreciate your time in advance. I want to start out by talking about a sport that you and I actually, we both know I'm a big fan of. And it's my understanding that part of one of the happenings in this sport is why you got involved in some of this policy and research in the first place. And that's this issue in mixed martial arts with Fallon Fox. And I want to start out with that because all too often in the endurance space, and I think in ultra running in particular, we get caught in this really narrow silo of sport and of rules that pertain to sport that they should only be applied within the sport that we are focused on. And that's fine. That's because we care about running and things like that. But all too often we lose context that there's a bigger sporting environment around there. And when we come to conclusions about, hey, listen, this is the type of policy or direction that we should take, or here's this, rule that we want to put in place, that there might be ramifications of that outside of the endemic sport that we're used to. And I think that there's no more different sport as compared to ultra running as mixed martial arts. But also for the things that we're going to talk about, it serves as a really big magnifying glass for what's at the heart of this issue. And so I've heard you describe this before, so I'm going to turn it over to you. The listeners are not going to be familiar with this story.
Okay.
So why don't you take them through the whole thing and how this initially caught your eye?
So the story of Fallon Fox, and we'll talk about the details shortly then. The story of Fallon Fox was the first time as a feminist, and I would say a kind of, someone who does feminism but wouldn't politically label themselves as a feminist, and also someone who's sporty but not an elite kind of competitor. I'm a bit old now, but I was never, particularly elite. This was the first kind of conjunction of sport and feminism where I really thought, hang on a minute, there's something going on here that's, not really fair, not really right. So for your listeners, Fallon Fox is a trans woman. She's a MMA fighter. She's a former US Navy veteran who transitioned and became this, mixed martial art fighter, and was put up in a match against a very, very good female MMA fighter. And Fallon Fox, battered her, absolutely kind of overpowered her opponent, who's called Tamika Brents, to the point, and now I know mixed martial art is a violent sport by its very nature, it's a violent combat sport, left Tamika Brents with the need for lots of stitches, shattered her orbital bone. And Tamika Brents, after this, and after, being stitched up and that kind of thing, Tamika Brents said that she had fought an awful lot of females, an awful lot of women fighters, and she described herself as an abnormally strong woman in her own right, had never felt so overpowered. And we're talking things, like grip strength and just the ability to kind of, like I say, completely overpower this very elite female fighter. And that's when I thought, hang on, we're watching now, we're celebrating, we're arguing for inclusion of someone who has had, for me, I'm a developmental biologist, so, this kind of understanding of how bodies develop and grow and become different between males and females. We're celebrating how someone who's had the advantage of being male for a very, informative part of their physical development, being in a ring where they are physically, where the sport is to physically harm the other person, and that this is a dangerous situation. So that's really where I started to think, or as you say, it captured my desire to understand, like, why are we in this situation? Is this some unique type of thing that is not happening across sports, for example. But or is this, a signal about where sports is going, and that this is going to be an issue that we have to start to deal with? So I started kind of digging into it from that event.
And like I said, it's a magnifying glass over the issue itself, because the sport, as you put it, is you're trying to beat the other person up in the ring, right? It's a very physical collision type of sport. We used to call it a collision sport. We used to call, hockey and football collision sports, and basketball contact sport. This is a very hyper example of a sport where physical harm is kind of the outcome. It's kind of the desired outcome. And I bring it up from the get-go because whenever we come up with these, kind of absolutist statements for everybody needs to play ball, or we're going to exclude everybody, you can always come up with hyper examples on one side of the fence or the other to justify those positions. And all too often in running, we think about policy as just pertaining to running, but it really doesn't. And so I want to use that as a little bit of a launch point to the research paper that you wrote in conjunction with Tommy Lundberg, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for his work over the years. I've followed his work for a number of years, and I've used it in my coaching practice. I'm going to put a link to the research paper in the show notes so everybody can access it. It's open access. Nobody should have a problem. It's actually quite readable. But was that the launch point for you to go into this from a perspective of, hey, I'm actually going to write a review article on this? Or was there a couple of other steps that you initially took in order to start that part of the process?
So I had started with this Fallon Fox, like you say, capture the attention, focuses this lens, and had started then to dig around into other sports. And I'm a scientist, so, I sit there in front of Excel sheets and make graphs and start to calculate percentages here and there and that kind of thing. And I was starting to collect not just case stories, because there are several case stories where we could, you can talk about particular trans women who are successful, not just in like a combat sport where the results are particularly kind of visual and visceral, if you like, but also in things like weightlifting and cycling and across the board. So you've got these case reports, but that's not necessarily so satisfying to me. I wanted to try and find out kind of systematically how males were performing relative to females, and whether what were the hormone treatments that trans women are undertaking and how that might affect their performance. So I started kind of digging into, look, here are these advantages over a variety of sports, and, from something that's a very individual, non-contact. If you're injured, it's probably very individual. You're not taking someone else out in the process. Something like running, cycling, rowing, those kinds of things. Maybe less so cycling because you might collide. But all the way through these kinds of contact, collision, through to combat sports, where you can start mapping things like punch difference, or the force through a punch motion. So starting to map these differences and starting to build a database, I suppose, almost like what I consider to be a resource that I hadn't really thought about necessarily using in terms of policy guidance. And then it became obvious that there was this gap in knowledge about how to understand how trans women might be performing in sports, and I started getting requests for my data. And then I started to, I'm a scientist, I'm thinking, do I publish this? How do I publish this? What really is that? What really are the questions that need to be answered here? And digging into things like the International Olympic Committee policy and that kind of thing. And then Tommy and I actually met. We both were asked to consult for World Rugby, who in 2020 undertook a review of their inclusion policy for trans women. And we were both independently asked. I'd seen Tommy's work, But then we kind of linked up. It turns out he'd done a lot of the same kind of digging around of stats that I had. And it just became very obvious that we could, review these and try and formulate some recommendations or try and create a framework that sports federations might want to have a look at when they're formulating their own policies.
Can you, since before we jump into the paper really quick, and you've already gone through this aspect, can you briefly go over what you and Tommy kind of advised World Rugby and then what the outcome of that is? Because once again, the listeners are not going to know.
For sure.
They're not rugby followers. There might be a small handful of them, with all due respect to all the rugby players out there. That's not my audience. But can you just take the listeners through that really quick?
So my role in the World Rugby Consultation, the workshop that they ran, was really from a very basic developmental biology point of view. Here are males, here are females. This is how, on average, as a class, males are different from females, and this is how it translates into sporting differences. And I would say that creates a kind of null hypothesis. That is, the reason we have separate sports categories is because males and females, on average, perform differently in sports. And there are very, very few sports where males don't outperform females. So that was my role as a developmental biologist. Tommy, as you will know, is an exercise physiologist, an exercise clinician. He studies people's muscles and how fast they can produce forces and all these kind of physics terms that I vaguely remember from 20 years ago at A-level physics. And he has undertaken a study of, an original research study of how trans women, in accordance with sports policies, which are standard kind of suppression of testosterone for a year, how does that actually change how they can move their muscles, what force they can produce, what's their muscle mass? And he's actually taking this cohort further for some quite deep molecular analysis of their muscles. So we had this kind of scientific kind of input here. And what World Rugby decided from this was that, first of all, the male advantage is very big in rugby. We're talking about a heavy contact sport where mass matters, where the speed at which you can shift into a tackle matters. We're talking about a sport that has got a particular responsibility to minimise things like head injuries that come out of tackles. And what they decided, and it wasn't just me and Tommy, it was a huge number of people talking about various scientific aspects, including Joanna Harper, who obviously would be considered on the other side of my point of view, and included advocates for trans inclusion from kind of a social perspective. It included advocates for female athletes. It was a very deliberately very well kind of created group of people together. And what World Rugby came up, or what they decided at the end, was that the risk of injury and tackle is big in rugby anyway, and some of these injuries can be quite severe, and that the male advantage is simply too big, and there isn't enough evidence that it's mitigated sufficiently by the standard practice of taking down testosterone levels for a year. So what they ended up with, and I think a lot of people miss the point, is that at the moment, as the evidence sits, we don't think it's safe in elite competition for trans women to play in female categories, but that they will review this, depending on whatever evidence is coming through.
And I think from a sporting perspective, and I don't know if you had perspective of this when you're actually going through the workshop and advising World Rugby, is that became one of the models for other sporting organizations to use since then, because for whatever reason, we don't need to go through this now, they were one of the first one of the first that were confronted with this issue, and they had to create policy around it. And everybody else is kind of playing catch up, especially in the contact sports.
So I think that, yes, they were the first to really, tackle it head on, of necessity, because, rugby does deliver, unfortunately, some quite severe injuries. And rugby has got a really good history of being very sensible about trying to minimise and, mitigate injury risk. And so I think they felt it, like I say, this kind of special duty to investigate this, because until they did, and they came back with the idea that the International Olympic Committee policy wasn't fit for purpose.
Right.
And until World Rugby said that, I don't think anyone with authority within the sporting world, I mean, I've questioned the policy for a while, but any kind of federation had really questioned what the International Olympic Committee had set down, first of all, in 2003-4, and then kind of refined in 2015. And so to have a major sports federation come out and say, look, this policy isn't really working, and it's certainly not working for rugby.
Right.
And I don't know, I wouldn't want to suggest it's a floodgate opportunity, but it should rightfully empower other sports federations to, rather than follow IOC guidance without their own due diligence, to look at what works best for their sport and whether there are risks, or whether perhaps in something like running there's less of a safety risk, so we don't need to think about this and that kind of thing. So hopefully it empowers other sporting federations to make their own policy.
And this is always the issue when big, organizational level policies in sport are adopted by other sports or other organizations. And it doesn't matter whether it's a transgender policy or a doping policy or some other type of rule. Whenever the IOC sets it, which is typically what happens, and that's what happened in this case, and other organizations just adopt it because of this leadership position that the IOC rightfully has, the nuances of each organization are kind of lost. And as you said, the kind of the use case or the purpose of the rule in the first place is not directly translatable in all different sports. And I'll also say across different levels of sport, because there are different ideals that each level of sport will have. The IOC is looking after a completely different cohort than the Michigan State High School Athletic Association. And when they're looking at the IOC to adopt their policies, they have to realize that they have a different constituent base that they have to serve with those rules. That's commentary for maybe later on in the discussion, but I hope we do get into it. But I want to kind of pivot to this paper and to that you and Tommy wrote, and to kind of set the stage of this. We can always take transgender policies a ton of different ways. You can take it a social way, you can take it a scientific way, you can take it from a competitive standpoint. I want to focus on the science first and foremost. I know that those Venn diagrams are going to overlap in places. That's inevitable, and I'm kind of fine with that. But my kind of goal with this is to educate the listeners on the science side of it, so that the community eventually can come up with their own decisions, because I think that there is a little bit of a knowledge gap between what is emerging science, and I think you would admit that it is still emerging, what still is emerging science on certain aspects, and how the community takes that and then ultimately applies it within a particular sport. So let's first take like a broad level overview of the paper itself, and then we'll try to like drill it down into endurance specifically, which is ultimately what we're after.
So what the first, I guess the narrative that we followed was what I think is a very ground up narrative. And as I've said, I'm a developmental biologist. So it's understanding why male and female bodies are different, and they are on average different, and understanding how that translates into sports and in different sports. And male and female bodies are different on a lot of levels here. So we have things like average difference in height. In adulthood, males tend to be about 5 inches taller than females. We have a much larger muscle mass with males, particularly in the upper body. So their legs may be something like 30% stronger in the upper body. We're looking at something like 60% stronger. So bigger muscles and different types of fibers. Males have more fast twitch fibers, which is the type of fiber that gives you explosive power if you're doing something like weightlifting or you're punching. Cardiovascular capacity in terms of higher hemoglobin levels. Males have got bigger hearts, they've got bigger lungs, they can get more oxygen to the muscles. They can, basically males can make themselves move more quickly and with far greater force. And that's relevant across an awful lot of sports. It's not relevant for every single sport, but it is relevant at some level in an awful lot of sports. And we can talk about different extremes. If you're running a throwing competition, the gap is massive. If you look at something like, how quickly can men throw a baseball, which is essentially rotation through the hips and these much wider shoulders and bigger muscles kind of making you spin. Males can throw a baseball over 50% quicker than a woman can. If you look at how quickly can males punch, they can punch with 160% greater force than a woman can. But if you look at something like running, where it's very lower leg dominant and women tend to have proportionally more strength in their lower than upper body, that doesn't mean they've got absolutely more strength than males, but they have proportionally more in their lower body. The gap is it's much smaller than it is in these upper body dominant sports. So you're looking at something like 10 to 12% in running disciplines across distances up to about 10K. And actually, if you look at longer distances, which on various databases, you can still see these gaps across lots of distances. So we see these performance gaps that are different across sports. They're consistent that males are almost always stronger than females. One might argue that, in female gymnastics, females have the advantage because they're more flexible, but you could also say that female gymnastics was developed to, complement the female body in that sense. And a female wouldn't be able to compete with a male on the rings because they're not as strong. So this kind of performance gap across lots of sports, and then using that as a baseline, this is why females have protected sports, because if they didn't, if sports was just completely mixed, then females wouldn't win. They wouldn't win in any running races. They wouldn't win in any swimming races. They wouldn't win at tennis. They wouldn't win in golf. They wouldn't win in weightlifting. They wouldn't win in a mixed martial art fight.
And I think this is really well illustrated right off the bat in the paper in Figure 1, where I really appreciated what you and Tommy did with this, where you not only took whole sports like running and pole vaulting as a sport, but you also took components of multidisciplinary sports, so like a pitch or a golf drive, and you compared those between males and females just to show the difference in between them. And I encourage everybody who's listening to check that figure out. It's Figure 1 in the reference paper, because there is a marked difference depending upon the sport and or the activity. But there were none that were listed where there is a female advantage. And you mentioned there are a few anomalies to which that might be the case, gymnastics being one of them. But on the whole, the performance difference is at least 10%.
At least 10%. Yeah. So, as I say, I would say that female gymnastics has been developed as a protected female sport, from which males are excluded. There's a really cool YouTube video of some elite female gymnasts looking at males doing their events like the beam, for example, which males don't typically do. And actually the males are pretty good at it. It's just they don't. There are a lot of overlaps between male and female gymnastics. Yeah. Both, work a floor event. There are some bar movement events. There is the vault. And actually, when you start to look at how males do perform in events, here, there's not the strength component overtakes the kind of nominal advantage, the flexibility that females have.
And one of the other aspects of the paper, because all too often we get caught up in elite athletics. And I just mentioned earlier, we take the IOC's policy, and they're definitely trying to serve an elite athlete constituent. And different groups adopt the IOC policy that might not be, their constituents might not be elite athletes. You and Tommy spent a couple of different sections in the paper talking about non-elite cohorts and what we know about those non-elite cohorts. What can you tell us about that?
So in non-elite cohorts, so these are, your average kind of averagely sporty males and females that are coming in and getting their, metrics tested in a lab. And we see differences of a similar, if not larger magnitude. Such that, so the statistic I referenced earlier in terms of the increased ability for a male to punch forward, that was done in a moderately sporty, general population rather than in any elite athletes. If you look at, one of the things I did look at, which is not in the paper, is the running gap at my local club. I'm in Manchester. So a big city in the UK with a good sporting kind of culture and lots of facilities and that kind of thing, lots of funding. If you look at Manchester 5K or 10K records, at the elite level, we see a gap of 10 or 11%. But actually at club level, it starts to run at about 15 or 16%. The gap. There are perhaps social factors at play there that females at club level haven't trained quite so much, or there's some socialization that they haven't had the history of training that their peer males have. But there's certainly no indication that the gap at what we in the UK would call club level is any smaller. There's no at elite level, there's these gaps, but at club level, it goes away. That's absolutely not the case.
So it's relatively similar. If anything, there's a bigger...
Yeah, it's of a magnitude, that's the same.
Okay. So that paints a broad picture of all of sport. And I think we can kind of summarize that as the speed and power sports, there's a bigger male advantage. At the endurance sports, there's a smaller male advantage, but it's still on the order of 10-ish. We'll use that 10-ish%. Fair conclusion there.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
So now here's where the policy rubber meets the road when it comes to transgender in sport. And the strategy that the IOC and many other sporting organizations have adopted is that one of two things need to happen. And you're probably going to have to explain this in much better detail than I am going to, because I'm going to generalize a lot of different policies into one. One or two different things have to happen. The first thing is testosterone levels have to be below a certain amount. And the second thing is they have to be a certain time frame removed from a point in the transition phase. I'm trying to generalize this as much as possible without pointing one specific thing out, because there's several different policies.
Okay. So
find that point, right?
The IOC guidelines.
Yeah, you could start
with which most sports federations, not all sports federations, but most follow, are that, and these are 2015 guidelines. They had a slightly different policy when they first formulated it 10 years before that. But from 2015, the guidelines are that a trans woman must have had their testosterone lowered to below 10 nanomolar. Now, don't worry too much about the units. That's just a kind of measure of the amount, the concentration, the amount of testosterone, circulating in their bodies. It has to be lower than 10. Now, the average male testosterone level might be about 20. The average female testosterone level is usually about 1.5. So the IOC said, if trans women are below 10, that's a qualifying kind of, that's a criterion met. They said you have to be below 10 for at least 1 year throughout that year before you compete. And obviously you have to be below that threshold during the time at which you compete within the female category. And that you have to make a kind of solemn declaration that you are female. And that once you do that within a sporting environment, you're not allowed to switch categories back. I think it's 4 years. I think they say once you switch into the female category, you're not allowed to flip back. So trying to weed out, kind of a cynical, exploitation of this policy. So they're the IOC rules as they stand. And as you say, sporting federations, because it's the IOC, kind of say, well, they must be good rules. They must be, they must be decent rules because it's the IOC. And so sports federations, and it's almost not, I don't want to say it's an abdication of responsibility, but it's always good when a central body that you can defer to gives you this guidance, and you can then just say, well, we're going to follow the IOC rules. And sure enough, that's what an awful lot of sports federations did, without necessarily questioning whether they were good rules or not.
And the rule that I sent you beforehand to do a little bit of research takes a little bit of that. And this is the rule that Western States uses, the daddy of all 100-mile races, that basically just says that you have to be under medical supervision for over a year to compete as a trans woman. And so what I view that as is they're adopting some part of this IOC language without having to do the actual testing of the athlete. And kudos to them for being on the leading edge of it, because you go across the rest of the trail and ultra running world and it's a lot of silence in terms of where do these races actually stack up against that. So I just wanted to provide that as a point of reference, and that I'll link to that policy in the show notes as well. But here's where the rubber meets the road. Does that actually remove, and this is what everybody wants to know, does the IOC's policy as it's actually written actually remove the male advantage for these athletes once they re-enter the competition as a trans woman?
So that was the key question that Tommy and I tried to address in our paper. And we took a particular angle because we felt that strength is a major component of an awful lot of sports. And I'm aware we are kind of talking about some kind of ultra distance running events where that becomes perhaps less important, but we'll get onto that. But we took this approach that essentially the male advantage is mostly driven by superior muscle mass and skeletal metrics, taller, narrower hips, bigger shoulders. So this superior musculoskeletal setup underpins most of the male advantage in most sports. And so what we did was have a look at, we tried to find, and I think we found them all, every paper where trans women had been measured for muscle mass, strength, and obviously height as a kind of metric, just as a routine part of their clinical kind of transition. So these are measurements that their clinical team would make in order to measure, are they losing muscle mass? That would be regarded as a kind of feminine aesthetic target.
It's not intended for a sporting.
No,
to evaluate some sort of like sporting discipline or anything like that. They're just going in for normal health measurements underneath the supervision of their doctor, and you're taking that data and presenting it.
Yes, so we kind of reinterrogated the data with a different question. So yes, this data was collected to assess the general health and perhaps in some terms the physical appearance of trans women, particularly things like bone density, which is really kind of quite an important health measurement throughout your life. So these were measurements that were collected just as general care. And what we said was, let's grab those measurements and let's see how much muscle mass is being lost in a year. How much strength, where those measurements exist, are being lost in a year. Now, Tommy actually, in his paper in 2020, had already started to ask that question, because his was the first paper where these were trans women who were part of, their normal clinical care, but Tommy had come in and said, hang on, I've got a sporting angle on this. And so that, his paper was framed very much to try and answer the sports question. And what Tommy and I did with this review is grab all the other similar studies to say, where are these cohorts of trans women? Who's measured their muscle mass? Who's measured their strength? And is there a pattern? Is there a kind of general sense where we can understand the magnitudes of loss, the magnitudes of change that trans women undergo within a year, which is the Sports Federation guidelines that have come from the IOC, to see whether this really is, meaningful. Is it a meaningful loss? Is it a significant loss? How does that relate to sports? So that was the question we asked of data that already existed in the wider sense.
And this is table 4 in the paper. Mm-hmm. So can you summarize that for people who aren't going to actually look the paper up and try to
absolutely
through all of the...
So what we did was we basically did a systematic search of the literature. We're looking for things like trans women, muscle strength, bone density, body composition, exercise, those kinds of things. And I think we grabbed everything because the body of literature is quite small and there's a lot of cross-referencing. We were able to pick up, I think, pretty much all the data. And someone would have told me by now if we did this one. So what we did was we found 12 studies in the end. 11 of them were within the Sports Federation guidelines. One of them was only for 4 months. So it's in that table, it's the first one. But that doesn't necessarily meet what the Sports Federation criteria are. But we found 11 studies. Overall, they covered around 700 to 800 trans women, 790 something trans women, who had all just part of their clinical care been measured for muscle mass, lean body mass, and some of them for strength. And we just started calculating how much loss over these 800 or so trans women, how much muscle loss do they see in a year? And actually what you find is that they don't experience a huge amount of muscle loss. So, I should say most of these trans women, almost all of these trans women are part of the general population. They're not athletes. They're not exercising particularly. We know that trans women generally don't undertake very heavy physical exercise. Again, that's an aesthetic kind of decision. And we also know that trans women but perhaps often have lots of issues with their diet and that kind of thing. There are some kind of comorbid conditions. So what we've got is the general population of trans women who are actually slightly unhealthy anyway. And when you look at how much muscle they lose within a year, it's very small. It's about 5% of their muscle mass. And so, that's a loss. And I understand that feels significant. And statistically, in I think almost all the studies, it was deemed to be a significant loss. But that's a statistical significance loss. And what we asked was, is that a meaningful loss as we compare it to females? And that wasn't a question that any of the studies asked, because that wasn't what they were trying to look at. But when you consider that males have on their legs 30 or 40% more muscle mass and on their upper body 60 or 70% more muscle mass, when you're losing 5% of that muscle mass, for sure, it makes trans women slightly weaker than they were before they started, suppressing testosterone. But it doesn't bridge this gap to where the male body has given them a baseline to create anything that I think is a meaningful parity with females.
I think the way that I heard you describe it earlier, which was really poignant, is that the suppression or the removal of testosterone, which is kind of the key part in all of this therapy, doesn't equate to a symmetrical change in the decline of any of these anthropometric measurements that you're looking at. Meaning, if you want to look at muscle mass, males are X percent, more muscular than women. Suppression or removal of that testosterone doesn't symmetrically move the needle from any of those metrics.
No, that's absolutely right. And like I say, if we look at something like in Tommy's original research study in 2020, there is a small loss in quad muscle. But when you map that to strength, the strength loss was smaller. But when you compare to a female cohort, their strength is still 40% higher than in those females. So I think that's the part of the review that has challenged a lot of people, that there's this discussion that the trans woman population as an exercising population and as a baseline perhaps not engaged with sports and those kinds of things, that they're different from control males. And I do understand that, but we were concerned or interested in looking at how they map to females. And even though they experience a loss, they still map tens of percents higher in terms of muscle mass and strength than females. And so there's this idea that trans women who are suppressing testosterone can no longer compete against males who aren't doing so. And I would acknowledge that, but the logic is not then that they must compete with females. That's a different question to ask and answer.
Well, and that's the relative cohort to compare to, right? Are the people that they're actually competing against? Because that's actually a piece of criticism that I wanted you to address that was in my notes, that the comparative groups are not the right comparative groups, to which I'm looking at this through a sporting lens, right? Not solely through a social lens. There's a little bit of social lens that you always have to use, but I'm predominantly looking at this through a sporting lens. And the sporting lens says we need to compare trans women to women that they're actually going to compete against.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, I think it is like I say, I think it's something that people miss when they look at the study. And even people who I think have read it and kind of perhaps agree with some parts of it, even if they don't like the kind of implications of what we've shown. I think there's this confusion that we're saying trans women are, in a sporting sense, equivalent to, what people would call cis, men. Men who haven't avoided sport, who are kind of going out there and doing it, and I think they've missed the fact that we're saying, like you say, they're not competing in that category now. They're asking to compete against females, and actually the gap between trans women and controlled males is very small compared to the gap between both of those and females.
100%. Okay, so here's where all the race directors need to listen up. We've already gone through the fact that ultra running is like super fractured, and there's probably, a couple hundred race directors or people that are involved in race directing that are going to be listening to this and trying to figure out some sort of guidepost. And the only guidepost they have right now is essentially the IOC and maybe Western states, certainly Western states, I'd say, from an ultra running perspective. So let's really drill this down into endurance performance, because that's what's going to be the group of people, the group of athletes that they're most interested in serving and creating policy around. This is section 4.3 from the paper. We've got it right in front of me. Emma, you can take it away. What are the key points from an endurance perspective?
So, first of all, there aren't that many studies of endurance parameters in trans women. There is one major study that was conducted by a trans woman middle distance runner, and I don't think she'll be offended if I say, a kind of sub-elite club, good club runner, called Joanna Harper. And so she had conducted this study of how trans women perform in middle distance running, middle distance, anything from 5K to a marathon, after transition. And what she came up with back in 2015, and actually was this, I think, was a key part of how the IOC formulated their policy in 2015, which was that they think there's no particular advantage when trans women suppress testosterone. What she showed was that in these trans women runners that she'd collected data from, that it's a bit complicated. But you may well be more familiar with these terms. That if you map in an age-graded kind of way, runners as they were racing as males, and then you look at their times post-transition within the female category and accounting for age grades, then what she showed was that there is no difference. That is, that someone who is a 70 percentile male was running as a 70 percentile female, and proportionally around those. And that was, so there were a lot of problems with the study, and I don't know, I don't want to speak for it, but it wasn't a particularly well executed study. It was a great idea. It's exactly what the kind of studies that we need, what's actually happening to performance here, rather than saying, for example, muscle mass on the legs gets smaller, but what does that actually mean in terms of delivering performance? So I think it was a great idea. It was quite badly executed, but there are limits to how many trans women athletes you can collect and study and those kinds of things. But a really small number of athletes, and a lot of times were self-reported. There weren't, I think about 50% of them weren't verified. So it was essentially a survey.
Right.
Yeah. Of people's, Strava times, or just remembering that 10 years ago they'd run a marathon in this time, and now as a female, it was proportionally kind of slower in a what would map to a sex difference. So it wasn't very well controlled. I mean, it wasn't controlled at all. It's 8 case reports, which is not of no value, but to form a sporting policy around it was quite remarkable, I think.
Well, I take it in two ways, and I'm really glad you brought up Joannas Research, and I respect her tremendously. She's given a lot of advice and counsel to the same bodies that you've given advice and counsel to. But a lot of people in the endurance community have used that research to essentially validate the fact that trans women are on the same playing field as women when it comes to endurance sport. But they don't realize the context of how the research was actually conducted, which is you mentioned it was 8 people, which that's not too far outside the realm in an exercise science perspective. Sometimes we're lucky if we get 12 people in a study, but to use a lot of self-reported data, and it was not controlled in the best way, to then use that study as this blanket argument to say, oh, well, we're going to base all of our policy off of this, or this is why I believe this. I think that part is a stretch, because there's so much more that goes into it.
Yeah, it's been used as a very kind of iconic, I don't know if that's the right word, this kind of benchmark. It's been used as a benchmark, and actually it's very easy to understand how it's more a preliminary look. It's one of those studies where you say, look, here's 8 people, they didn't all become slower runners. One of the runners in her cohort actually improved hugely. And that was, this runner was dismissed as a bit of an anomaly, but the reason given was because the runner had started training properly and had started, actually really going for, I think it was a marathon kind of type distance, had actually started training for a marathon, and no acknowledgement then that if you do train whilst you're suppressing testosterone, actually there's no necessity that you will become a slower runner. But so these kinds of things were ignored, dismissed as anomalies, and what you are left with is a small collection of data that, like I say, I just find it remarkable that anyone would have used sporting or would have created any sporting rules around it.
But training is always the confounding variable in any exercise science intervention. If you say, okay, we're gonna have a group of people, and we're going to give this group of people intervention A, and this group of people intervention B, and there's a time gap between how you're evaluating A and B, the training that happens in the middle, which can affect performance and all of these other, physiological variables, always confounds things. It happens with altitude, it happens with nutrition, it happens with supplementation, all of these different things.
And
age, absolutely. So I use that as a little bit of a dialogue to just say this is like, that's kind of a normal confounding variable. So here's where I come to this one section of the paper, Emma. It's a lot of mechanistic speculation. Not speculation, but it's a lot of looking at mechanisms and then speculating how those mechanisms could eventually affect performance.
The way that Tommy and I have dealt with that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think because there are some reliable measurements about physiology that we do know are very likely to impact performance. So the obvious one is that when you suppress testosterone, hemoglobin is reduced. Now we know that hemoglobin, these are the red blood cells that carry oxygen around your body. We know that the amount of hemoglobin you have is very testosterone sensitive in males and females. And so when you reduce testosterone, it's well known that hemoglobin shifts to kind of map this loss of testosterone. And there is no doubt that hemoglobin, the amount of oxygen in your blood that you can get around your body, is providing an input into your performance. And so when you lower hemoglobin, it's absolutely intuitive. And I would not question, I have no, it's almost certainly true that if you lower hemoglobin, you're going to suffer an oxygen deficit compared to, your kind of higher hemoglobin state. So I think that that's quite an argument. I have no real need to reject that. This is almost certainly true. So there'll be a performance penalty in that sense. When you lower testosterone, hemoglobin is going to, flatten or drop, and you will suffer. You'll feel like you're not kind of, you don't have quite as much kind of CV capacity. What I would argue is that we know hemoglobin isn't the only thing that contributes to your CV capacity. And that it's not just about how much oxygen you can transport around your body, but it's also how much oxygen you can get across your lungs, which if your lungs are bigger, you've got a bigger surface area, so you can get more oxygen across. If your heart is bigger, you can pump more blood volume around your body, and how your individual muscles respond in their own kind of metabolic environment to the amount of oxygen you're getting. So hemoglobin loss is going to impact your CV capacity. I don't think that's controversial. I don't think it's going to be a major impact, but I think it will be an impact.
And here's what people want to know, right? We started out with the premise that in an endurance sports, the male advantage is about 10%. Then we went on to the premise that using some sort of testosterone suppression is going to remove not all of that advantage, is certainly across the speed and power disciplines. But do you think, and I always hate to ask scientists this because they hate speculating on things, but do you think that in an endurance discipline that asymmetrical aspect still exists, meaning that 10 to 12% advantage is reduced by 10 to 12%? in a symmetrical way, or is it reduced less than that? What would be your speculation if we could actually do the research? And you can feel free to say no comments because we have...
No. I absolutely wouldn't. I genuinely, for anyone listening, I genuinely want dialogue on this. I want, we can get all ideas out there. We can talk about everything, and we shouldn't need to pretend that some things don't exist, or some scientific relationships don't exist. So do I think that in an endurance sense, that if you lose testosterone, that will create parity with females? No. I think it has the potential to create more parity than in weightlifting or in boxing, ignoring the safety aspects of those things. But I think it has, because the gap is smaller, and because endurance running, in terms of the body systems it uses, relies less on explosive power through the muscle. It relies less on fast twitch fibers that drive that explosive power. The way that, I've run a couple of marathons, but that's as far as my kind of running career goes. The way it works on your tendons and your ligaments is very different than it, works if you're trying to lift weights. So it's, when you weight a sport away from muscular force, the gaps are smaller and they may be closer to parity. There are still some very fundamental advantages that males as a class will possess over females when it comes to running. I think the Q angle, the width of the hip, how you move force through your legs, how you travel forwards in a more efficient gait, is going to be something that is absolutely irreversible.
Right.
And it will, there's no way that we understand skeletal levers and, skeletal metrics change with suppression of testosterone. These things don't change. So the favorable running gait, men have got straight legs, women have got knees that bow inwards. And that means we have to put more effort in to move forward in a straighter direction. So those things won't change. So will it deliver parity in the sense that, you're creating a trans woman who is as if they'd never developed as a male, as a hypothetical, do you understand what I mean? As if they'd never developed as a male, then no, it won't.
I really appreciate you indulging that question. I understand that it's a hard one because we don't have a lot of good concrete evidence to look one way or the other. But I think the picture I wanted to paint across all of the sports and the differences in the male advantage across all the sports and how those might be removed with testosterone removal or suppression. That's the point that I wanted to get across to the listening audience, that it's not a universal blanket that we can apply to every single sport, which I think has kind of been haphazardly thrown around. The other thing that I want to have some dialogue with you about, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on it. I'm a coach. That's my profession. And I know as a coach, if I work with an athlete for a year and I get to train that athlete and give them workouts and put them through their paces and things like that for a year, I know that the effects of that year of work are going to show up 4 years down the line, 5 years down the line, 6 years down the line, maybe for forever, irrespective of what they do in the meantime. It has a long-term, especially when we're talking about endurance sports, it has a long-term chronic effect. And one of the things I think about with this issue is that you have trans women that are born in training as men for a certain portion of their life. Who knows how long that is, 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, whatever. But they're training underneath a different biology than women for a significant portion of their lives. And that doesn't go away instantaneously. There's a long-term training effect. And the analogy I always make is that everybody wants stiffer doping penalties because we know that the effects from doping last far longer than the acute effects of taking the drug themselves through training. There's a compounding effect that happens through the actual training intervention while the athlete is actually taking the illicit substance that shows up 4 years, 5 years, 60 years down the road. And that's why all the athletes want stiffer penalties, because they realize that the advantage is not lost once the doping suspension is over. And I'm not making the analogy that trans women are doping. Let's stop that, because I'm going to get a lot of hate mail after this if I don't make that clarification. But the mechanism is very similar, because you're training in a different way. You're training with different biology, and that training has lasting effects for far longer than any sort of acute time frame can really take into account. And that's what makes policy so hard, because we don't know what the length of that is. We want to say it's a year. Okay, it's a year. I don't think it's a year. That's me as a coach, right? I just mentioned that I know that those effects last more than a year. But should we hold people out for sport for longer than that? I mean, so I wanted to have some dialogue with you about that in terms of, what do you think, like, the training effects of going through those paces with a certain biology? Are we ever going to be able to track that down, or do you have any thoughts on it? It's such a hard question. I can't even eloquate it.
No. And it's an analogy I've made before. And I would absolutely reiterate that when I make this analogy, I am not accusing trans women of cheating or doping or anything like that.
I want to make that clear again, too, because I will get more hate mail if I don't.
I've made the analogy, and because I am going to talk about females who dope and cheat. And so if you think about a trans woman in terms of just their development and biology under elevated testosterone, now that's not necessarily elevated for their natural physiology, but
Sure.
but we'll call it elevated for the purposes of the analogy. And then you think about a female who would naturally have far lower testosterone, who boosts their testosterone to perhaps match that male, and is therefore doping. And let's say they do that for the first 18 years of their life, or for 5 years, or like you say, for 10 years. But when a female stops taking testosterone, where is that time where you think
Right.
that, like you say, under training? And it's not necessarily the things that testosterone does to you in a physical muscle mass sense, although that's obviously part of it, but resistance to injury, the ability to keep on going for another, sprint when you're kind of powering through. Where is your mental wall? Where is your aggression? Where is those kinds of things? The ability to train harder rather than, just physically what is happening with your muscles or that kind of thing. And so there is an analogy, and I think it's reasonable to say, when would we forgive, or when do we recognise that a female who is doped for 10 years or 15 years, when do we think she is able to compete fairly with other females? And my answer would be, and there's probably a feminist kind of social aspect coming, my suggestion is she'd probably never be allowed to compete again. I think if a female is doping for 15 years, she's never going to be allowed to compete again. And that tells you that there is an underlying understanding of what 15 years, 10 years of testosterone can do to a body, that you simply can't ever be assured that the trajectory has changed from this line to this line. You can never be assured that either it's going to reach parity, or even that where it would have ended up if they hadn't have done that. Right. It's kind of a bit hypothetical. You're trying to understand how quickly would that female have run if she hadn't have taken testosterone. I mean, the answer is we don't know. Right. But what we do know is testosterone does this, and we, to bodies. And I don't know what the answer is. If you look at long cohorts of trans women, so by that I mean trans women who are kind of 10 years post-transition, and often surgically transition, so full on no testosterone at all. small amount from the adrenal glands, but that's negligible. If you look at those cohorts and you don't have comparisons from the start, and we talk about a cohort in the paper that Tommy and I wrote, a cohort where we don't have starting measurements, or we have end measurements after about 8 years of transition. And they are, these trans women are a bit weaker than they probably would have been after 1 year if we'd have had those measurements. But still, when you go back to comparing with like a like-for-like female cohort, they're still a lot stronger. They're like 25% stronger on their grip strength. And so it seems that there isn't, I think that's an average of 8 years. Some of the trans women in that cohort were a lot further past transition. But it seems that there is a very long-term effect. And like you said, is it ever reversible? It doesn't seem that likely. And as a developmental biologist, that doesn't feel particularly intuitive that it would be completely reversible. But that's my own kind of opinion on that.
Well, and the other thing that you touched on a little bit is there's likely to be a tremendous amount of individual variability on those aspects. I just happen to have access to, because our lab here in Colorado tested people, both trans men and trans women before and after their transition. And I could take those case studies that we have, and let me just say this from the get-go. We're really fortunate to have access to that data because it was not intentional from the get-go. I mean, this was several years ago before a lot of this started to come into the spotlight. I could take the very, very small sample of people and not make any conclusion from it at all, because it doesn't align with anything that I've ever seen ever, because all these things are at such an individual level that it would be impossible for me to conclude based on those very narrow specific examples. Oh, this person's going to do this and this person's going to do this. You're really fortunate that you've got access to, and you've analyzed, you said 700 or 800 trans women and can draw some general conclusions. But I use that as an example just to say that there are enough trans men and trans women, who we've been speaking about predominantly, in the community that we will hear all of these different flavors of stories in terms of how their individual performances and how their individual running or whatever was different pre, during, post, whatever, at whatever point during that journey. And we can't always take those individual anecdotes to be representative of the whole.
No, I think it's so. Yes, I absolutely agree. I think sports works generally on kind of class level performances. If one wants to start investigating individual level performance, then you're making an argument, not you personally, but one is making an argument to remove categorization. That if this person runs a marathon in this time and this person runs a marathon in this time, then you put them in a race together. And it doesn't really matter how that person, what kind of disadvantage, physical or otherwise, that person is overcoming. And so the idea, I think, that at the individual level things vary is true. It's not always true in the in one direction. There are some trans women who become stronger. There are some trans women who become, and if you want to argue for individual assessment, that opens up so many more questions, and fundamentally I think it becomes just impractical to regulate. Because I could give you a list of 6,500 gene differences between males and females and tell you that you need to score all of those, and it kind of like falls into an almost like solipsism kind of, everyone's different. Let's just send everyone down a track or around a course.
So let me ask you this. Since this topic is incredibly complicated and there are all these individual differences, and there are tremendous differences across all of the different sports, do you think that is part of the reason, or maybe a lot of the reason, that has led a lot of society to take these polarizing views to inclusion should be the default or protection should be the default, just because we can't make sense of it.
So I think an awful lot of, if you're involved in a particular sport, it's very clear to you within your own sport, what are the kind of key metrics, what are the things that make someone better than someone else. If you are a kind of more social commentator who doesn't particularly have an interest in sport, I agree, it can all just look like it's a bit of a mess. And right. That, I read an article today that was in Newsweek arguing that nothing in sport is fair because basketballers are tall and baseballers have got great eyesight, and almost this Peyton Manning's dad is famous, so that's why he got a bit of a leg up, in NFL. And so this idea that because nothing is fair and it's all such a mess that we should really kind of stop trying to make it fair. And I really reject that. We can have some clear ideas of fairness or what I would call kind of unjustness rather than unfairness. We can have clear ideas about what is fair and what isn't fair and what we can regulate and what we can't. But I do think that a lot of people, particularly those who aren't engaged in any sports, just view it as a social problem to be solved rather than, if you're within a sport, thinking about the competitive needs and the different people who are competing and how you include them in particular categories, or if you have to exclude them from a particular category, how do you open up a new race for this group of people? So I think there is a bit of a we can't solve this, so why should we try? And I find that remarkable. There were competitive sport is not only a really valuable thing for a lot of individuals, it's a major economic force. It's I don't know, the GDP of sport must be massive. It's important for a lot of people and on an individual level and from a spectator point of view and stuff. So I don't really buy the whole it's too difficult, let's just let everyone have fun. This is, maybe I've always been regarded as quite a competitive person. Maybe that's that personality coming out. But
well, I think some of the friction point comes from when we try to apply. I mentioned this a little bit from the onset. When we try to apply policy that's meant for the most elite of the elite, whose values are centered around fair competition, into what I'm going to call participatory sport. So your club runs, right, that you just mentioned in the UK, and you go to, your backyard 5K and marathon and things like that, which are largely, there are a lot of elite athletes that go there, certainly, but are largely participation types of events. When we try to downfeed those, and we see this going back to a doping example, I just now remember this. We see this in cycling and triathlon here in the US with USADA's what I'm going to call their club programs. So they can, USADA, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, for USA Cycling and USA Triathlon events, they will test at random a certain selection of the age group competitors. So your 50-year-old male that's fourth place in the local criterium, they'll come and pluck them out of a crowd and go and test them. And inevitably what happens is some, 45-year-old dude gets popped for the heart medication that his doctor prescribed him. And he just doesn't care to look it up on the DRO because he doesn't think that he's going to get, randomly drug tested his weekend triathlon or something like that. I mean, that actually happens a lot. That's an example of elite level rules that are getting pushed down to a community or participatory level that kind of go afoul. That person's not trying to cheat. He just doesn't know what the rules are. Now, that's not the same as what we're talking about here, but when we take transgender policy that's developed at the elite level, and there's certainly flaws with that, but we try to force feed it down into the community level. That's eventually where a lot of the friction points come, because the value set is different, right? The value set isn't necessarily hinged on fairness and competition, which it tends to be more so at the elite side. So that's my commentary. I'm going to give you the last word though, Emma, because you've got a fascinating perspective on this, and I appreciate you indulging us in some of your opinions that go kind of along with the research that you've done. What would you advise how would you advise the community to look at this issue? And the community being the race directors who ultimately have to figure out how they orchestrate their race rules, the competitors who have to navigate it from a competition standpoint as well as a social standpoint, and then the community at large who's also participating in these events. What are some of like the big things that you would counsel people on if you were to come into the community of ultra running like you've done for rugby and other organizations? What would that look like?
So I think so if we start with rugby, and as an example of a sport where there are concerns outside of safety, outside of participation, when people participate, they're taking on things like risk, for their kind of personal safety. If you are regulating a sport, as running almost always is, if you're regulating a sport where those safety risks go away, you only have to consider fairness. The safety, fairness, inclusion, I would argue safety is something that you don't compromise on. Fairness and inclusion start to become, like you say, particularly at a kind of recreational level, something that you might feel you can balance a bit more, and you might feel that the social purpose of sport is more important than the competitive aspect of sport. So if you don't have any safety issues, then you're just kind of balancing up fairness and inclusion. And I do think if any regulator feels that they can run their races at the level at which they operate in a way that is inclusive, everyone runs together, say, and I gather is that the case in kind of ultra, the 2 marathons I ran, I was running in a mixed field. Now the females were kind of separated in terms of their results, of which obviously I was nowhere near a scoreboard, but you're all running together, and it's all kind of a kind of fun time.
It is a fun time. We do have a good time at Trail Ultra Running.
Sure.
You should come and do more of them, because it's
well, I have messed up knees. Someone said to me that maybe trail running would be a solution for this, rather than just pounding on a road for 4 hours. But if you're not, if by including a trans woman within a female kind of category, you're not popping a female out of the bottom. There's no female losing a place. If you can record female data in a way that you can analyse and continue to keep records for females, then sending 50 or 80 people along a trail and telling them to get on with it is far less of an issue than it is, when you're regulating the 100-meter race at the Olympic final. I absolutely acknowledge that. I would say that if the sport involves contact or collision or something like that, you do have to consider that it's not just always about an individual's participation. But I absolutely acknowledge that those things don't always feed into something like running.
And then what about at the elite level? Because you're right, in participatory sports, most of it is everybody going around the trails having a good time. But in mass participatory sports, whether it's triathlon or marathon running, or in this case, trail and ultra running, there is a small sliver that is an elite cohort that is going to be more concerned about the fairness of competition as compared to the rest of the population at large within that sport. Are there any nuances within that group that they can take under consideration?
My position is that if a sport has a strength or skeletal component, I don't see any justification to include trans women within a female category. Now, that is slightly different from perhaps running races at the same time. perhaps, sending everyone out together, like I say, but recording differently. But I don't see an argument for inclusion of trans women in female sports. And I definitely think that that's the way the burden of proof lies. Female sports are a protected category. And if you want to open, and they're a protected category from males, and if you want to open that up to trans women who have gone through an awful lot of male development for sometimes an informative part of their life, the burden of proof is to say that this is fair. And there are burdens of proof with that position that haven't ever been met. And so when we're talking about elite competition, and not always, lower level kind of participatory sports do lead to competitive opportunities. So there is a bit of a balance. The idea that it doesn't matter in schools. All schools are where people find, which sports they're good at and where they might be able to develop something that is a competitive prospect for them. So I think it's a fine difference between trying to understand when an event is just genuinely everyone having fun. Maybe people don't really care apart from the top 5 men, the top 5 women, and maybe there's not a trans woman anywhere around. That doesn't, you start to not have to worry too much about it. But I think where there are competitive benefits, where it benefits a person to finish in a particular place, either because it accesses something in the future for them, or they win some money, or whatever. I think that we really have to be quite cautious here, because as far as I'm concerned, there's no evidence that it can be a fair thing to include trans women.
Emma, I cannot tell you how much I appreciated this dialogue and satiating our curiosity on this. You did it in a very intellectual and balanced way and put up with my bumbling types of questions brilliantly. You're always welcome back on this podcast to discuss it even more. And if you want to get into trail running, I can definitely point you in the right direction in your area. And if you're over here in the States, you're welcome to come out on a trail run with me. I'm going to put links to all of your research that we referenced in the show notes. Is there anywhere else that you want people to get a hold of you, or any way that they can learn more about some of the things that you've done and some of the research that you published?
So I'm quite active on Twitter. My handle is @fondofbeetles. And our paper contains our emails and those kinds of things. So I'm always happy to answer questions. I'm always happy to talk to people, even those who, we might not reach the same conclusions, but I think sports is something that is, can be dealt with quite scientifically. So talking is good.
And if anybody else wanted another vouch for Emma, I can see an 8-bit Nintendo system in the background. Yeah, it's right there. I remember that from my childhood. I just noticed it 5 minutes ago.
And we've got loads.
Shout out for holding on to that for, 30 years maybe. So
Game Boys and SNESes, and I don't know what's on that cupboard. It's not mine.
They're brilliant. Wow. You should take credit for it because it's pretty darn cool. Thank you, Emma. Like I said, you're welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. And there you have it, folks. There you go. Much thanks to Emma for coming on the podcast today. I have to tell you, I found that conversation very balanced and enlightening and insightful on many different aspects, not just the strict scientific ones, but also some of the extrapolative ones and some of the policy ones that are always hard to pin scientists like Emma down on. So I appreciate her entertaining some of those what if types of questions, because that is certainly not something that they're trained or accustomed to or even like answering. I appreciate everybody that listened to this podcast with open ears and an open mind. You are more than welcome to send me any feedback, My Twitter handle is @JasonKoop. Instagram handle is @JasonKoop. I always love hearing from everybody on what you thought about any of the episodes, and this one in particular. I do hope that you take something away from this and something that helps form your future opinions on it, because this is an aspect of sport that is staring us in the face right now, and it's going to continue to stare us in the face for the long run. Appreciate the heck out of everybody listening today. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.